The Austro-Hungarian Empire, 50 million people, a dozen major languages. The inheritor of the Holy Roman throne, the guardian of the Alps, and the Adriatic and the Great Plains of Pannonia, did not fall. It dissolved. It went the way ice goes in warm water, not breaking, not shattering, but thinning at the edges, losing coherence, releasing its molecules one by one back into the surrounding world. Until one morning, you look, and it is simply gone, and the glass holds only water. There is a particular smell to a palace when the heating fails. It is not the dramatic smell of catastrophe, not smoke, not gunpowder, not the metallic sting of blood on cobblestones. It is something far more intimate and far more devastating. It is the smell of cold stone and old wool. It is the smell of wax candles burned down to their brass holders in rooms that once blazed with electric light. It is the smell of parchment going damp, 600 years of correspondence. 600 years of imperial decree. 600 years of the word Habsburg pressed into hot wax and sent to the four corners of a continent, going soft and mottled in the autumn chill of October 1918. This is the story of how an empire dies. Welcome back to Whispered Chronicles, echoes of forgotten lore. The Hofburg Palace in Vienna covers nearly 250,000 square meters. It has approximately 2,600 rooms. And in October 1918, it was running out of... Before we enter those rooms, before we stand beside Emperor Karl I at that desk in the failing light, we need to understand the scale of what dissolved. We need a lens through which to see it clearly. The tools historians now use would have seemed like sorcery to the men who lived through 1918. In 2026, genomic archaeologists at the University of Vienna and the Central European Institute for Demographic History published a 12-year study. They called it the Viennese Melting Pot Project. They used voluntary DNA samples from over 40,000 living Austrians, combined with archived biological samples from the interwar years, hair and lockets, dried blood on soldiers' letters, teeth from mass graves. From these, they constructed what they called a dissolution map. This map does not show borders, it shows bloodlines. What the bloodlines reveal is something the peace treaties of 1919 could never accomplish and never undo. The empire did not vanish. It went underground. It became cellular. Genetic signatures of Bohemian Czechs appear in Viennese shopkeepers' great-grandchildren. Mitochondrial markers of Croatian mountain families surface in the DNA of families who have called themselves Austrian for 3 generations: Slovene, Ruthenian, Polish, Romanian, Hungarian. The genetic stratigraphy of the old empire persists, layered like sediment. Beneath the clean surfaces of the new national identities that replaced it, the borders died. The people did not. And then there are the ghost trains. In November 1918, 3 million soldiers from Austria-Hungary simply began walking home. Not deserting, as the concept had become meaningless. There was no longer an army to desert from, no command structure, no empire capable of enforcing orders. They stepped off their posts on the Italian, Serbian, and Carpathian fronts. Some still carrying rifles, most not, and they began to walk. They walked through forests, through towns renaming themselves, through the wreckage of a logistical civilization, the vast Habsburg railway network, now overloaded to breaking point, with men who had only one destination in mind: home. Contemporary linguistic geographers are tracing these ghost routes, using a remarkable methodology: dialect drift. When a Hungarian soldier walked home from the Italian front, he passed through Slovenia, Carinthia, Styria. He begged food at farmhouses. He slept in barns. He talked to people, and the language is cross-pollinated. Specific Hungarian loanwords appear in the Carinthian German of villages along the old march routes. Serbian constructions surface in Slovenian border communities. The ghost trains left linguistic fingerprints on every town they passed through, and those fingerprints have survived a century. The empire dissolved in November 1918, but the empire walked home through the autumn leaves. And everywhere it walked, it left a little of itself behind. To understand how Austria-Hungary collapsed, you must first understand what held it together. The dual monarchy was one of the most improbable political constructions in European history. It was not held together by ethnic solidarity. There was none. It was not held together by shared language. There were 11 official languages. The daily miracle of the imperial bureaucracy was that a telegram sent in German from Vienna could travel through a relay of clerks and translators, and emerge coherent in Croatian or Czech or Romanian at its destination. It was not held together by shared religion, though Catholicism provided a powerful cultural gravity in most of its territories. It was held together by what we might call the three pillars: the emperor, the army, and the bureaucracy. The emperor was not merely a political leader. He was a living symbol of a specific theory of governance. The idea that a single sacred figure could stand above all ethnic and national identities and command the loyalty of every subject regardless of language or heritage. Franz Joseph I, who ruled from 1848 until his death in 1916, had perfected this function. He was not Hungarian or Czech or German. He was Habsburg. Habsburg was its own category of being. Like a gravitational field that bent all other identities slightly toward its center, he had been emperor for 68 years. He had survived the assassination of his wife, the execution of his brother, the suicide of his son. He had outlasted every revolutionary who threatened him and every diplomat who underestimated him. When he finally died in November 1916, in the middle of the worst war his empire had ever fought, the mourning was not ceremonial. People genuinely wept. Not for a politician, for a fixed point in the universe that had suddenly moved. His great-nephew Karl had 18 months to fill that void. He had been raised in provincial obscurity, never expected to rule, given no preparation for the throne. He was conscientious, deeply religious, personally gentle. He was, by every account of those who knew him, a good man. He was, by the judgment of history, entirely unsuited to the moment. What was needed in 1916 was a Franz Joseph, an emperor who could project the mythic weight of 600 years of Habsburg rule with every gesture. What arrived was a thoughtful young man who genuinely believed he could end the war through personal diplomacy and transform the empire into a modern federation through the force of his moral example. He was not wrong to believe this. He was only wrong about how much time he had. The army was the second pillar, and in many ways the most important. The Kaiserlich and Kielich, the K.U.K. military was the only institution in the empire that truly belonged to all of it. A regiment in the Austro-Hungarian army was a babel of languages, commanded in German, with sergeants who could curse fluently and 6 others. There were Czech soldiers and Bosnian soldiers, Tyrolean mountain troops and Hungarian hussars, Croatian infantry and Galician riflemen. What held them together was not nationalism, but something older and more stubborn: military culture, unit loyalty, the specific pride of men who have survived the same mud and cold together. By 1918, the army was 4 years into an industrial war for which it had not been designed and could not be sustained. The casualty figures are almost incomprehensible. Over 1 million dead, over 3.5 million wounded, over 2 million prisoners of war. The Carpathian winter campaigns of 1914 and 1915 had destroyed entire corps. The Brusilov offensive of 1916 had shattered the Eastern Army so completely that the High Command never truly recovered. By October 1918, the army was still fighting on the Italian front, with records of genuine resistance, but it was fighting with men who had already begun, in their hearts and in their letters home, to negotiate their own private peace. When the front finally collapsed on November 3rd, it did not collapse with a dramatic rupture. It thinned. Battalions stopped receiving orders they could understand or trust. Officers looked at maps that no longer corresponded to reality. And men, individually, and then in hundreds, simply set down their rifles, picked up their packs. They turned their faces toward wherever home had been before the war began, to erase all the old certainties. The third pillar was the bureaucracy, and this is where the most extraordinary story of the dissolution lives. In a filing cabinet in the Austrian State Archives in Vienna, a folder contains the final requisition orders. These KK War Ministry orders are dated October 28, 1918, 3 days before the armistice with Italy. 13 days before the formal renunciation of Karl I, they concern the supply of winter boots to garrison troops in Galicia. Galicia had declared itself part of the new Ukrainian People's Republic 11 days earlier. The bureaucracy kept filing. The empire had already moved on, but the paperwork continued, because the paperwork had always continued, and because the men who filled out the forms had no other language in which to exist. The Habsburg bureaucracy was not merely an administrative structure. It was a way of being in the world. It was the structure that told them who they were across 12 nations. The writer Robert Musil would later call the empire Kakania. From the initials KK and KUK, he meant it as mockery. It was mockery, and it was also a kind of elegy. Because Kakania, for all its absurdity, had given tens of millions of people something. The reassurance of being part of something larger than yourself, something that would continue to function tomorrow. Regardless of who you were or where you came from, as long as you did your job, paid your taxes, and sent your children to school. When the bureaucracy stopped, when the forms ceased to mean anything, when the stamps and seals became museum pieces, there was a specific kind of grief attached to it that had no political name. It was the grief of people who had built their lives inside a system that had, without their consent, and almost without warning, simply decided to stop being real. On October 16, 1918, Emperor Karl I issued what became known as the Valkersmanifest, the People's Manifesto. It was a document that would have been revolutionary in 1848, transformative in 1905, arriving in October 1918. With 3 weeks left before the empire ceased to exist, it was the right answer to the wrong moment. The manifesto proposed the transformation of Austria into a federal state of free national councils. Czechs, Poles, South Slavs, Ukrainians, each national group would receive its own council with genuine autonomous authority. The empire would become a voluntary association of peoples, bound by shared institutions rather than a hierarchy imposed by Vienna. Karl envisioned something not unlike what the European Union would attempt to construct 80 years later. The reaction was silence. Not the silence of contemplation, but the silence of men who have already moved on. In Prague, the Czech National Council had already begun organizing a Czechoslovak state. 2 days before the manifesto's publication, the manifesto reached them as a historical curiosity, like a wedding invitation after the divorce has been filed. In Budapest, the Hungarian government under Count Károlyi was in the final stages of declaring full independence from Vienna. The personal union of the dual monarchy was dissolving from the Hungarian, and at the same speed it was dissolving from the Austrian. Károlyi was a genuine idealist who believed a democratic Hungary could make a separate peace with the Allies. He was wrong, as the Treaty of Trianon would devastate. But he was wrong with great conviction, and had no interest in Karl's federal proposal. In Zagreb, the South Slav deputies were already in communication with the Serbian government about a future Yugoslav state. The word itself, Yugoslav, South Slav, carried a magnetic force that Karl's manifesto could not counter. It pointed outward, toward a new thing, rather than inward, toward a reformed version of the old thing. And so the telephone in the Hofburg study rang outward. The silence that came back was not the silence of a bad connection. It was the silence of capitals that had found a different conversation to have. Karl understood this. By late October, telephone logs in the Austrian state archives showed a pattern that requires no interpretation. Calls from Vienna to Prague, no response. Calls to Lemberg, no response. Calls to the Joint Finance Ministry in Budapest, answered by a clerk who politely explained the ministry was being reorganized. There is a word in German, Weltschmerz, that means the pain of the world, the ache of the gap between how things are and how they ought to be. Karl I lived in a state of permanent Weltschmerz for the last weeks of his empire. He was a man of genuine moral seriousness, placed at the center of a catastrophe he had not caused and could not stop. He walked the corridors of the Hofburg in the evenings, deliberately and slowly memorizing a place he knew he was about to leave. The tapestries were still on the walls. The portraits of his ancestors still hung in their appointed places. The clocks still ticked. Servants were occupied with the increasingly urgent question of what was going to happen to their pensions. Let us be forensic about this. The first pillar fell on October 28th. On that morning in Prague, the Czech National Council formally declared the independent Czechoslovak Republic. The declaration was read aloud in the Old Town Square to crowds that had been gathering since dawn. The weather was cold and bright, making everything seem both more real and more fragile simultaneously. People wept. They embraced strangers. A Czech officer tore the imperial insignia from his uniform. A photographer captured the moment. The photograph ran in newspapers across Europe, showing the future. The emperor pillar had fallen. Nations conferred their meaning on something else. The second pillar fell between October 29th and November 3rd. The armistice with Italy was signed on November 3rd at the Villa Giusti, near Padua. Marshal Diaz received the Austrian delegation, accepting their army's resignation. The terms were harsh, but the negotiation was marked by mutual exhaustion. These officers were not broken, but deeply tired, given permission to stop. Between the front's collapse and armistice, the ghost train phenomenon began. Officers issued no orders. Soldiers made their own calculations. A man from Moravia traced a route home. A man from Sarajevo walked south. A Transylvanian cavalryman, not seen his family in 41 months, walked east. The records of railway stations along these routes are extraordinary documents. Station masters confronted crowds of men for whom no ticketing system existed. Some issued free passes, some waved them through, some were ignored. This was not a rout, not a panic, just the slow, enormous, unstoppable, gravitational pull of home. The third pillar fell last, because bureaucracies always fall last. The administrative apparatus continued to function for weeks after political structures dissolved. Customs officers collected duties at borders that were ceasing to exist. Tax collectors made their rounds in villages, being incorporated into 3 different successor states. The magnificent Habsburg postal service continued to sort and deliver mail. Delivered mail according to old imperial postal districts for a full week after they were redefined. It is tempting to read this as comedy, the bureaucracy that outlasted the empire. But it is not comedy. It is something more human than comedy. It is the portrait of people who had built their identities inside a system. They could not stop being who they were, simply because the system had decided to stop being what it was. The clerk who went to the office on November 12th, the day after Karl's renunciation, and sorted the morning mail according to the old imperial categories, filed the outgoing correspondence under the old imperial registries, and made careful entries in the same ledger book he had been keeping for 9 years. That clerk was not being absurd. He was being loyal, loyal to a habit, loyal to a self, loyal to the only version of order he had ever known. There is a specific object in the collection of the Vienna Museum of Military History. It is a rubber stamp. Imperial black rubber, mounted in a brass handle, with the double-headed eagle of the Habsburgs embossed on its face, and beneath the eagle, the words KUK Arma Commando, Army High Command. It was used for the last time, on November 3, 1918, to countersign a requisition for artillery shells. Shells that would never be fired at a front that had already ceased to exist. The stamp sits in its display case, and the ink on its face has long since dried completely. You can stand in front of it and watch tourists pass it by without stopping, because it does not look like the end of an empire. It looks like office supplies. It looks like the most ordinary thing in the world. That is the point. The end of an empire looks like office supplies. It looks like a cold room. It looks like a telephone that no one answers. It looks like a rubber stamp making its last impression. On paper that no one will ever read, in the name of an authority that has already, quietly and without ceremony, left the building. In Schlosser, a hunting lodge east of Vienna, Karl moved the imperial household here as the Hofburg became unsafe. The streets of Vienna were filling with men who had no patience left for emperors. On the night of November 11, 1918, an aide brought the emperor a document. It was not an abdication. Karl refused, on principled and quixotic grounds, to abdicate. An abdication would acknowledge he had a throne to give up, implying judgment on his dynasty's legitimacy. He was operating in a universe of legal distinctions irrelevant to everyone except himself. The document he signed was the Verteidigungserklärung, a declaration of renunciation. Not renunciation of the throne, but of participation in state affairs. It preserved theoretical rights while relinquishing practical ones. His lawyers and advisors worked for days, hoping history might leave a door open. The door was not left open. The document was signed. The pen used was an ordinary pen. This is not a metaphor or embellishment. The extraordinary end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire had ordinary props. The aide, Arthur Polzerhoditz, spent his career in imperial service. He would spend his life writing memoirs, as if narrating could restore their weight. Karl signed the document and put down the pen, looked out the window. The garden of Schloss Akarzo was wet with November rain. The lime trees had lost most of their leaves. The grounds were dark. He did not walk out the front door of the palace. He left through a side entrance, as one leaves a room where a difficult conversation is ended, as one leaves a place where there is nothing more to be done. He stepped into a waiting car. He drove east, through the darkness and autumn rain, into a future that had no use for him. He was 31 years old, would live 7 more years in exile on Madeira, far from everything he had known. He died of pneumonia in 1922. He was beatified by Pope John Paul II in 2004. Recognized as a man of heroic virtue, he tried, at great personal cost, to do right by his people in an impossible situation. He was the last emperor of Austria-Hungary. He signed his last document with an ordinary pen. In an ordinary room, while rain fell on the lime trees in the dark garden, and the clocks in Vienna continued to tick because no one had yet been given the authority to stop them. Here is what we are left with in 2026. 7 successor states emerged from the dissolution of Austria-Hungary. Most endured fascism, foreign occupation, or communist dictatorship. The borders drawn at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 were drawn with an optimism that the subsequent century did not reward. The ethnic intermixing that the Habsburg system had managed. Imperfectly but persistently proved far more explosive when forced into rigid containers. The name for what followed, forced migrations, ethnic cleansings, unmixing of peoples, is the 20th century in Central Europe. A history so saturated with violence that the relative mundane disorder of the old empire begins, in retrospect, to look almost like wisdom. There is a phenomenon documented across former Yugoslav states. Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Austria. Habsburg or nostalgia. It is not quite the same as the famous Yugo-nostalgia of the former Yugoslav republics, though the two are cousins. A nostalgia for a specific quality of civilization, the coffee house, the Viennese pastry, the bureaucratic thoroughness. The peculiar and earnest conviction that order and culture and multi-ethnic civility could be maintained by good administration and enough paperwork. It is a nostalgia not for the empire itself, for its wars, oppressions, failures, but for a possibility that the empire seemed to contain. The possibility that different peoples, different languages, different traditions could share a single system without any one of them having to disappear. The Habsburg myth, as Claudio Magri's named it, is the literary and cultural afterlife of an empire that survived its own death. It lives in the novels of Joseph Roth, who grieved for the empire in prose so beautiful it has outlasted everything he grieved about. It lives in the music of Mahler, a Bohemian Jew in the imperial capital, a man who was exactly the kind of impossible category the Habsburg system made possible. It lives in the architecture of Vienna, Prague, Lviv, and Sarajevo, cities that share a specific grammar of urban space, a Habsburg grammar. You can read it in their proportions and their ironwork and the particular angle of their street corners. And it lives in 2026, in a conversation that is more urgent than ever. We are watching in our own present. The fracture lines that the Habsburg system mapped and failed to resolve, re-emerging in different forms. The European Union, that ambitious, imperfect, bureaucratic, multilingual, multicultural attempt to build a political structure larger than any single nation's identity, carries within it the DNA of the Habsburg experiment. It has the same vulnerabilities, the tension between central authority and regional identity, the difficulty of maintaining unity among peoples who share a common framework but do not share a common soul. It has made some of the same mistakes, expanding faster than it could deepen, building administrative structures before it built genuine political loyalty. When we watch the EU struggle with its own centrifugal forces, we are watching a problem that Emperor Karl I understood from the inside of a cold room in October 1918. The problem does not have a clean solution. The Habsburg system did not solve it, but for 600 years, imperfectly, inconsistently, often violently, but with remarkable persistence, it kept trying. The empire dissolved. The experiment continued. Somewhere in a village in Carinthia, a family uses a Hungarian word for a kitchen implement that they cannot explain and cannot trace. Somewhere in a Prague cafe, An old man drinks coffee prepared in a style that has been continuous since the Turks left Vienna in 1683. Somewhere in the genomic database of the Viennese melting pot project, a DNA sequence carries within it the migration of a Transylvanian family, and a Moravian family, and a Dalmatian family. All of them now dissolved into a single Austrian identity, a single body, a single person who does not know that they are. In their very cells, an archive of the empire. The paper crown dissolved, but the people it crowned were real. And the real, as history has shown us again and again, has a persistence that outlasts every piece of paper. The empire is gone. But if you know how to listen, in the right cafe, on the right autumn evening, with the smell of roasting coffee and old stone, and the first cold breath of the coming winter in the air, if you know how to listen, you can still hear it very quietly going about its business, as if it never stopped. The map of 1918 was written in ink that refused to dry, but the map of 2026 is written in our very code. We are the living archives of a world that forgot how to stay together. Thank you for watching Whispered Chronicles, Echoes of Forgotten Lore. If you felt the chill of the Hofburg in this story, or if you have your own ghost roots in your family history, leave a comment below. I read every one of them. It is how we keep the lore from fading into total silence. If you haven't yet, join the Chronicle by subscribing. We have many more halls to walk through, and many more echoes to find. Until the next whisper, stay curious, stay grounded, and above all, stay safe.